Okay, so we're starting the next chapter on patterns of inheritance. We're going to discuss the basic problems of inheritance and talk about Mendel and how Mendel solved these problems to explain the behavior of what they saw with inheritance. We'll talk about alleles, alternate versions of genes, and we'll try and solve some simple genetics problems. I'm going to go through maybe half of the PowerPoint that's posted. I think a key thing here is your book kind of presents Mendel as a genius, someone who solved this, and it was a really difficult problem. But I think sometimes rather than presenting someone as a genius, it's better to talk about how they knew what they knew and why they made the advance and not someone else. And I think it's good to kind of look at guys now who people are sometimes calling a genius and to kind of say, well, maybe not in every way. And so a guy that I kind of thought was and heard people talk about as a genius was Elon Musk. He was an immigrant, went to college, got a business degree, and was one of the early people that developed PayPal. And he sold his stake in PayPal and then invested in a couple other companies, Tesla, Solar City, and SpaceX. Um, he's kind of a guy that's a big self-promoter. And so he's likes being in the spotlight. He lets people mistake him for an inventor, but really he didn't design or develop either the SpaceX spacecraft or the Tesla Roadster or any of those other cars. He's really the owner of a business, and he bought existing businesses, and he's run those businesses, but not really um, kind of who he might want us to think he is. And so he's been very active, very outward looking in how he does publicity, but I'm not sure that he's a genius, and I'm not sure if you look at him closely that you'd even think, well, he's maybe not what he says he is. And uh, kind of a comparison I look at is Jeff Bezos, another really rich guy. And like Elon Musk, his fortune is really based on the internet and being one of the first guys to develop a platform, an effective platform for making money on the internet. Bezos developed Amazon.com, not PayPal, but it's turned out to be really effective. And uh, like Elon Musk, he's also invested in other companies, and he has his own rocket ship company that I think we're going to hear more about. That's Blue Origin. I wouldn't consider either of these guys a genius, but they're effective businessmen and um, active in the press and in promotion. Well, I kind of think of Mendel in a similar way. Not that he was a business owner or a self-promoter, but he gets a lot of credit for things that maybe he didn't do. The problem of inheritance was a really big problem, and biologists had a lot of wrong ideas that they looked at development in animals and plants and thought, how could one cell, an egg cell, carry all the information to make an animal or a plant or a whole human being? The most common idea was that there were fluids that were transferred during sex that were blended between the male and the female, and that's how things got, you know, in, inheritance was transmitted. But it seemed like that was impossible because then you would blend traits, and traits seemed to disappear and reappear in no discernible pattern. And so they couldn't understand these hidden traits that would appear and disappear. However, these were biologists, and there was another group of people that was working on this in a much more systematic way, and they'd been working in it for hundreds of years. And these were the people that were working with agriculture. And I got two of the guys here that wrote a lot about it. Again, I'm not going to say that they were the inventors of the British agricultural revolution, but they left a lot of writing to show what people were thinking and how to do things. And um, like farmers nowadays, there was huge amounts of money at stake, and They were looking to increase production, to cover their costs, to make more money, to get greater yields. And this was encouraged by the government because it was known that, hey, if we have more productive farms, we will be a richer country and we will be better off. And these guys were, again, paying lots of attention to inheritance, and they developed principles on selective breeding. They couldn't tell you exactly how inheritance was transmitted, but they knew if you kept really good records of which fields produced the most, of which animals were most productive, and you allowed those animals and plants that were most productive to breed with other animals and plants that were most productive, and didn't allow organisms that were less productive to breed, that you could increase production and you could increase it dramatically. And so selective breeding and the ideas of getting pure strains of pure breeding animals that would always have these traits was really important. And a relatively new trait that was fixed and well known were traits for quality and production of wool. That's a merino sheep there. They were bred for wool production. That sheep that you see in the upper portion is the same one that you see in the lower portion, just sheared. The sheep in the other portion had escaped and been unsheared for, I think it was 2 years. And it produced a fleece that weighed, I think, over 200 pounds. Okay, this is an animal that's been bred to produce so much wool, it can hardly survive unless it gets sheared on its own. And so it's an example of how productive animals became if they were selectively bred for traits, specific traits. Mendel, they talk about his science background, they talk about his background as a monk, but he was raised on a farm. And he was raised at the time that these informations on selective breeding was becoming widespread. Mendel studied inheritance and he communicated this to biologists, but his methods of record keeping and of selective breeding came right out of agriculture. He selected plants he was familiar with, that he could control their fertilization. He followed very specific traits and he kept extremely good records. Okay, Mendel was not lucky. He knew exactly what he was doing because he was applying methods from agriculture. And Mendel's great laws were that traits were not fluids that were blended, but they were particulates. They were particles that were somehow transmitted. Each parent transmitted one particle for each trait, and that these particles were independently transmitted. They were, uh, the traits for flower color were not affecting traits for pea size or pod shape. And so he did this by using true breeding plants in an experimental approach called the test cross, developed right in agriculture. He took known traits, he followed them for several generations, controlling fertilizations, and he counted the number of offspring produced and developed ratios that allowed him to guess at what was going on. Okay, this was right out of agriculture. Okay, biologists didn't do this at the time. The traits he followed included flower color, uh, seed color, seed coat, uh, pod color, uh, wrinkled or smooth pod, plant height, and flower position. And what Mendel discovered was that parents transmit discrete factors. We now call them genes, and that each individual receives one copy of a gene from each parent. Those copies may be different or the same. Okay, they don't necessarily have to be identical. Mendel called them alleles, which means alternative forms of a gene. Individuals could be homozygous, having two copies of the same allele, or heterozygous, having different alleles for that trait. Mendel said that alleles remain discrete, they do not blend, but the presence of allele doesn't guarantee expression. dominant alleles were always expressed, but recessive alleles could be hidden, and that an individual's genotype, the set of alleles present, could be different from its physical appearance, the phenotype. Let me go through a simple example. This is the test cross, okay, where Mendel is going to cross true breeding purple flowered plants with true breeding white flowered plants. Okay, he controlled the fertilization, making sure that these plants fertilized each other. What he found is that the offspring of this cross were always purple, that they were always purple, and no matter what this happened, 100%. If he allowed these to self-fertilize, okay, so they would uh, fertilize each other, he found that the white flowered plant would, or white flower trait would reappear in the second generation. And that in that second generation, the ratio of plants was always 3 purple plants to 1 white plant, white flowered plant. This Mendel called this a monohybrid cross. And from this, he said that the phenotype can sometimes be different from the genotype. So these purple plants here must have carried a gene or an allele for this white flowered condition, and that could reemerge in this next generation when they were self-fertilized. Okay. And furthermore, if he allowed these second generation to self-fertilize, in 1/3 of these purple plants, all the individuals would be purple. In half of those plants, they would have a 3-to-1 ratio of purple to white flowered plants. And the white flowered plant would always produce white flowers. So this monohybrid cross was used to study 2 variations of a single trait. Mendel did this for true breeding pea strains that had 7 different traits. Each had 2 variants. Okay. For each of these traits, each of these ones, when Mendel crossed them, he found that all of the F1 plants always resembled one parent. He referred to this as the dominant trait, and the alternate trait was referred to as recessive. Okay, when these no plants with intermediate characteristics were discovered, and so that was the traits didn't blend. Okay, if he allowed these second plants to self-fertilize in the next generation, the offspring of the self-fertilized plants always appeared in the 3-to-1 ratio. So the hidden trait reappeared. That made him go back and say, okay, that 3-to-1 ratio is really 1-2-to-1. Okay, and so I'm going to stop there. We'll pick this up next time and go over this again. And then we'll talk about some more advanced characteristics. So Mendel discovered that hidden traits could reappear and that there were some traits that were always expressed and some were hidden.